hello everyone. I guess we are about ready to start. It's 2 o'clock and we will start on time. My name is Daryl Griffin. I am Program Manager for Innovation and Career Programs here at IEEE-USA, and I want to welcome you all to today's webinar. It's about our Government Fellowship Program. We have two exciting speakers today, Becky Taylor and Sherry Gillespie. They will be here and they'll introduce themselves for you. I just want to give a few housekeeping notes before we actually start the presentation. First, there's a chat pod which you can see right below the video, our faces. And you can type in your questions. If you have questions, comments, you can type in your questions right in that chat pod. The speakers will most likely take questions at the end of the session, but feel free to type in your questions as the session goes along, and they will definitely refer back to them. The next thing is that this webinar is being recorded, and we will put it up in our archived webinar section in probably about 2 or 3 days, hopefully before the end of the week. And we'll also try and make the presentation available to you by email either later today or tomorrow. I think that is about it in terms of housekeeping notes, so I will turn it over to Sherry Gillespie, who will start the presentation. Take it over, Sherry.
Okay, thank you, Daryl, and welcome everybody. It's really a pleasure to be able to talk about the Government Fellowship Program. That's certainly been very dear to my heart. The intent of the discussion will be linking IEEE members with government, and Becky Taylor and I are here to describe the details of the application process, what it's like to be a fellow, and then we will be talking about our personal experiences of having been fellows. I was the 2008 IEEE-USA Congressional Fellow, and Becky is one of the 2011 State Department Fellows. So you'll be getting a glimpse into both types of fellowships that IEEE-USA offers. So let me begin by mentioning that a little bit about my background. My background is in both physics and engineering, and I spent the bulk of my career in industry working at IBM and then Motorola, primarily in research and development for advanced computer chips. I was very involved with the industry as well as academia. A lot of our partnerships, which I was involved with, were with universities throughout the world, and so having this fellowship was a wonderful opportunity for me to get an immersion in government and policy, which was certainly an area which I had not previously worked in. So let's begin by talking a little bit about the program objectives. The idea is to give IEEE members a first-hand experience with the legislative and foreign policy policymaking processes, and basically to improve their understanding of how policy impacts science. Most of the work that one does when you're actually carrying out a fellowship is actually to provide technical advice and information to both Congress and the State Department. Those are the two types of fellowships that are offered, and to certainly encourage interest and participation in public policy making. I must say that once you get a taste of policy making, if you've been a professional working in the scientific and technical areas, I must say it's very easy for you to catch the bug. They call it Potomac fever around here, and it certainly is very catching, and I know I caught it. So here are the basics. So far, there have been over 90 U.S. IEEE members who have served as government fellows. The first fellows were in Congress, and it started in 1973. Each year, a maximum of 3 fellows are recruited. Typically, it's 2 congressional fellows and 1 State Department fellow. However, some years it can work the other way. For instance, in 2011, there were 2 State Department fellows and 1 congressional fellow. We've yet to hear a bad report from members of Congress. We have a quote here from Congressman Rush Holt from New Jersey, who said, "This fellowship program has been one of the most important initiatives in good government in the past century." he was obviously very pleased with the fellows that he's had. So what is it like? Once one is selected as a fellow, there's a 2-week orientation that is actually sponsored by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. So the next fellowship cycle, which we're recruiting for now, will be for the 2013 government fellows, and so they will be doing their orientation during September of 2012, so next year in September. And it's a 2-week orientation, and it gives you the complete lowdown on how Congress works, how a bill becomes a law. Just you hear speakers from various parts of government. It's just an absolutely fascinating process, and you learn a great deal, which gets you a lot more comfortable with embarking on the fellowship experience. And both State Department and Congressional Fellows go through this 2-week orientation. So once the orientation is complete, the next step for Congressional Fellows is to do their interviews. While State Department Fellows can start interviewing either before or after orientation, Congressional Fellows must wait till the final day of the orientation process. And then AAAS provides office space right next to the Capitol, where you can very easily go back and forth to your interviews in either the House of Representatives or in the Senate. And that interview process, that placement process, is extremely critical because fellows, it's really important to make sure that there's good compatibility, good interest commonality between you and the description of what a fellow will be doing in that office. Usually you're given a list of those congressmen that are interested in having fellows, so you already know that those are the ones that you might select for having interviews in their offices. It's typically a 1-year assignment in Washington, D.C. During the calendar year, January through December. There have been variations, of course, but that is the typical fellowship term. So let's talk a bit about qualifications. An applicant must be an IEEE member at the time of the application, a U.S. citizen, and in terms of academic and professional experience, it can be any combination of the following: a bachelor's degree with 10+ years of professional experience, or a master's degree with 5+ years experience, or fresh out PhDs or postdocs in the designated fields. For the State Department, it's very similar requirements of your background, but in addition, State Department fellows need to be able to obtain a security clearance prior to the beginning of the fellowship, and Becky will be saying a little bit more about that. Well, here's a picture of our 2011 fellows. There's Becky, who'll be talking to you a little later, Umesh Thakkar. And there are the 2 State Department fellows. Patrick Meyer is our Congressional Fellow for 2011. He's working in the office of Jay Inslee. Okay, who should be applying? Really, any IEEE member who has an interest in getting involved with public policy. It's a very broad spectrum of people in a wide variety of stages of their careers, PhDs and postdocs who are debating what to do next, mid-career professionals, people who have already finished one career and are ready for another. It's really wide open, and no one should feel, if you're an IEEE member, that that you should be wondering whether or not you might be a candidate. Certainly, you are. The stipends run from $55,000 to $65,000. with an additional $5,000 relocation allowance. Some employers do supplement that. We've seen a number of academic candidates who are on sabbatical get their stipends supplemented, as well as those coming from industry. IEEE-USA does reimburse expenses incurred for travel and housing during that 2-week orientation period and during the interview period. Okay, how do you get selected? Well, there's a 6-member Government Fellows Committee, and I have the honor of actually chairing that committee this year, and we'll be doing it again next year. And we review all the applications, and the finalists who are selected get invited to come in for in-person interviews, usually the following month after the deadline. The State Department always has a representative come and help with the selection of the Engineering and Diplomacy Fellow. So he works with us, he or she works with us on the selection process for that fellow. What we do when we get your applications is evaluate basic qualifications, education, experience, public service, IEEE volunteer activities, communication skills, your fellowship goals, and a variety of intangibles. The date to keep in mind is March 16th, 2012. That's when the 2013 applications are due, and as I mentioned, interviews will probably be then in April of 2012. I know that this raises a lot more questions, and we'll be happy to answer all of your questions as the webinar progresses. So here I am with my favorite building, the U.S. Capitol, and I spent lots of time going back and forth between the office where I was working and the Capitol. And what I will do now is switch gears from talking generally about the logistics of the application process and the placement process and talk about my personal experience as a Congressional Fellow. Well, I must say that one thing that was really important to me was to make sure that there was really good compatibility between my interests and experience and the office. And I interviewed extensively. I spent 2 weeks after the orientation and interviewed in over 20 different offices. I got second interviews in about half of them, and I got several third interviews, if you can imagine. By the time you get to third interviews, you know you're going to get an offer. And I ended up with 3 offers from 2 senators and 1 congresswoman. And in the end, it was a very difficult decision because they were all excellent offices. But I did choose the office of Senator Joe Lieberman. And 2008 was quite a year to be in that office. That was probably one of the most controversial senators on the Hill that year. So it was really a lot of fun from many different perspectives. But let me say that from the point of view of being a science fellow and basically a science advisor to the senator during that year, it could not have been better. He had a very strong record of support for science and science policy and science funding, and the compatibility, particularly not only with his experience but his staff, was really excellent, and that was really one of the reasons that I selected that office. I worked on many different things that year, but the highlight truly for me was the opportunity to actually draft legislation that passed. That's actually fairly unusual. What that legislation was about was actually about semiconductors, which is what I had worked on for my whole career. The provision which I wrote was a provision that was part of the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2009. And it was actually called Public Law 110-417, Section 254, Trusted Defense Systems, and it was signed into law on October 14th of 2008. I actually started working on that project in February, near the start of my fellowship year, and it went through the whole process of being initiated in the Senate, being scrutinized by the House, and then coming together into a single bill, which then became part of the Defense Authorization Act and ultimately signed into law. So that was quite a heady experience. But again, let me emphasize that every fellowship experience is unique. There's no question that it's different for everybody, depending on your interests and what you've actually had the opportunity to work on. It varies tremendously, and I think that in many cases it really changes people's lives. It certainly did mine. Just a moment on that legislation, because I think it was quite interesting to get a taste of what that was. By way of background, over the last decade or so, manufacturing in the U.S. has largely migrated overseas, and particularly in the area of semiconductors, which are the electronic components, which what was of concern here are those components that go into our defense systems. And so the concern was the issue of trust, meaning how could we be sure that those parts have not been tampered with? How could we be sure that they're not counterfeits? Unfortunately, it's been documented that a very large percentage of parts that have come in, unfortunately, from the Far East have in fact been counterfeit, and so the intent of the legislation was to address this issue. What was called for is for the Department of Defense to assess and prioritize the vulnerabilities, increase the use of trusted foundries, apply trust verification techniques. That means methods like perhaps X-ray technology and other approaches to actually, from a sampling point of view, test some of these devices, and most importantly, develop policies and strategies and actions to ensure trust, and then report back to Congress. So that project, like I said, was probably the longest term project that I worked on, but I did many other things while I was in the office, held briefings with the Department of Defense, the National Security Agency, and DARPA. I had an opportunity to write Dear Colleague letters. What those are bipartisan letters of support. The senator excuse me, was very interested in supporting the National Science Foundation, and so I got to solicit support from both Democrats and Republicans senators to support that funding. Other areas where I had an opportunity to participate was something called a spacesuit competition. That was the year that they were actually sending out bids for companies who wanted to design the next spacesuits for manned space flights, and that was an interesting thing to get involved with. All fellows who work in Congress typically get involved with making recommendations for legislative amendments, meeting with constituents, and one of the things that I did toward the end of my fellowship was draft a white paper on nanotechnology. That was, again, an area that I had previously worked on. I was invited to attend weekly staff meetings, and I must say that one of the things that was really delightful being a Congressional Fellow is I really was treated like any other regular staff member. In fact, your badges are the same, so that it's really transparent whether you're there for a short time or a longer time. Here I am with the Senator shortly after the legislation passed, and it was really a thrill to be able to talk with him about the legislation, get his overwhelming support, and to feel a real sense of accomplishment. Most of the work that I did was with the Senate Armed Services Committee in going back and forth and getting the language right to increase the opportunities of having it pass, and the Senator was extremely supportive of all of that. Okay, what happened after the fellowship was done? Well, it was actually kind of a surprise to me. Toward the end of my fellowship year, after the legislation passed, I was actually contacted by the Department of Defense to come and consult for them on working on how to respond to the legislation. It turned out to be really fortuitous for me because I was very interested in staying on and continuing to work in that area, and so they arranged for me to get on as a consultant with the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. That's a think tank here in the Washington area, and I'm currently a senior fellow with that institute, and so I've been consulting ever since. And in addition to my work as a consultant, I am working with IEEE-USA on the R&D Policy Committee. And as I mentioned before, I'm also a member of the Government Fellowship Committee now, and I'm now chairing it. So, I've moved to Washington, D.C. I changed locations. I was previously in Austin, Texas, and I'm just delighted to be here and continue in this area and the wide range of opportunity one has to combine policy and science, and it's a great feeling to be able to give back after working so many years in industry and have an impact in a very positive way on policy, particularly policy as it relates to technology. So for me, this has been a tremendous benefit of my IEEE membership, and I certainly welcome you to apply and do the same. Now I will turn it over to Becky Taylor, who will describe her experience as a State Department Fellow, also called an Engineering and Diplomacy Fellow.
Thank you, Sherry. Well, I'm very interested in our audience, and if some of you wouldn't mind, I'd like to get you to put in the chat window 2 pieces of information. One is, where are you located? And the second is, if you want to put in brackets, greater than this age, less than this age, I'd like to get a feel for the career stage of the folks that have decided to join in this discussion. So maybe if you could do that while I'm introducing myself to you, that would be very interesting to me, and I'm sure to Sherry and to Daryl. So again, my name is Rebecca Taylor. I am a computer scientist, senior member of the IEEE. And my decision as far as applying for the fellowship was largely driven by an event that I had some control over, but not a whole lot of control over, and that was the graduation of my son from high school and heading off to college. And so I decided that I have always wanted to do some form of meaningful public service, and I really looked around and felt that the IEEE program was really quite unique in that you have the opportunity to get plugged in, deeply embedded into the government at pretty nice levels depending on where you decide to go in the State Department or in Congress. And as Sherry has amply shown with her examples, have a real impact on something. So, in 2008, 9, gosh, I don't even remember now. I applied. Maybe you can help me with the date, Sherry. And I had no idea, that my career path would intersect so perfectly with the interests of both Secretary Clinton and President Obama when I applied. My background includes working in the process control industry, doing real-time, deeply embedded, high-performance data acquisition and control systems, first at Fisher Controls. And then in the late 80s, I was working in one of the best places I can imagine in the computing field for somebody in their 20s, and I was at Digital Equipment Corporation for a number of years. And then I left DEC when they started to change, and right before they got bought by Compaq, I decided to leave and start my first company. And I've been doing startups in the technology space, also in Central Texas, ever since. And so when I applied for this, I had no idea that entrepreneurship and innovation was going to be in just about every speech that both the President and the Secretary of State have been giving for the entire time that I've been in Washington. But it certainly has given me a feeling of being able to directly contribute to things that are of distinct interest to the administration, and that always feels good. So a little bit on the differences, as Sherry pointed out, the two fellowships are a little bit different. And I'll dive into that in a minute. But specifically, where I am serving within the State Department is in the Office of the Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary. It is a small office, and the role that I'm playing is Senior Advisor in the areas of innovation and entrepreneurship, directly relating to the years that I have spent doing startups. In the year that I've been here, I've had a very wide range of exposure to a lot of different activities within the State Department. Many of them are, but not all of them, are related somehow to the State Department's desire to figure out how to reach out and work more closely with technology startup companies, both here in the United States and overseas, and to help stimulate and foster more entrepreneurship, particularly in developing countries overseas. And so that's been a fascinating opportunity to be involved in that. Also, my office specifically is focused on our relationships on a science and technology basis, both with the university communities around the world as well as at the national lab and at the ministerial, and that would be like our Department of State level, with governments around the world. We have many, many, many bilateral science and technology agreements with dozens and dozens of countries around the world. And our office does not manage those, but we tend to look out for the relationships that maybe should exist and don't, and then we go out and proceed to make those happen, and then we turn those over to another office within the State Department to handle. The interview process, Sherry talked about that a little bit. I would just like to underline and reinforce that the interview phase of figuring out where you're going to spend your year really is critical to the overall success of your fellowship and the kinds of experiences that you will have. And I'll say for my own purposes that I paid a lot of attention to the physical chemistry and the personalities of the folks in the office, and looking for that personal fit for myself. And that's a little bit different than sometimes an engineer will use more of a pros and cons, Ben Franklin kind of approach. But I really wanted to get to know the people, and so I would encourage you, if you do apply and if you are selected, to really spend that time like Sherry did. She had 24 interviews. I didn't have quite that many. I found the office I wanted to be in fairly rapidly and made my decision pretty quickly. But that's a little unusual, and so you should plan to talk to lots and lots of offices when you go through the interview process. You're allowed to be here, I believe, for almost a week, Sherry, is that right? And I would encourage you to leverage that time very, very fully if and when you are selected.
Actually, just to answer that question, AAAS provides office space next to the Capitol for 3 weeks after your orientation for Congressional Fellows, but state fellows can interview really anytime after they've been awarded the fellowship.
Okay, thank you. So, the Department of State is a very large organization. I think it might be helpful to go over that a little bit for those that might be trying to determine which of the two fellowships they'd like to pursue. State Department is, of course, a global organization. It has over 60,000 people work for the State Department. 2/3 of those are foreign nationals working in our embassies around the world. The other way to look at the employment base of the State Department is the division between civil servants and foreign service officers. Foreign service officers are the career folks that you think about that go from embassy to embassy to embassy, and they rotate in their assignments about every 2 or 3 years. So you tend to see, if you're here in Washington, you tend to see a lot of people in your year who may be finishing or beginning their foreign service assignments. And so you really do meet an incredible variety of very interesting people who have had very interesting career experiences. I've had some amount of involvement with the embassies, and that's something that I was very interested to do. Because of the nature of the office that I'm in, we are a very externally focused office. I work a lot with not just the embassies, but the science and technology officers that are housed here from all the countries around the world that have embassies here. And I have had such wonderful experiences working with those folks. For example, working with the Italian science and technology officers on issues related to research into osteoporosis that involves both of our space programs. So not only am I externally focused working with entities outside the State Department, I'm also working a great deal with other agencies within the U.S. government. I'm working collaboratively on a number of projects that involve NASA and the Defense Department. So it's been a huge exposure experience for me. I spend a lot of time outside the building, almost as much outside the building as I do inside it. So those are the things that I was looking for, and I found that very rapidly in the S&T office that I'm in. But the folks who come into the State Department, they go everywhere. The other thing that's important for you to understand about the way the State Department is structured, again, to think about where you might want to fit in, is there are two basic kinds of offices inside state. One is what they call regional bureaus, and those are the bureaus that actually deal with particular geographies around the world. So we have the Western Hemisphere. And the Western Hemisphere Bureau has responsibility and works closely with all of the embassies that are located in countries stretching from Canada down to Tierra del Fuego. And we have the EUR, the European Bureau, and they deal with all the European countries. We have the Near East Asia Bureau that deals with embassies in countries that are in that particular area. So that's the geographic area, and so you'll get exposed to lots of different issues that are all important to those embassies in that particular geography. The other type of bureau or office that's in the State Department is what's referred to as a functional bureau. A great example of that is a bureau that I work with a lot, and that's the Arms Control Bureau. And those are the folks that every time we negotiate a treaty, such as the New START Treaty that was ratified by the Senate late last year, there are a whole host of verification activities that are negotiated in those treaties. And somebody, in this case in the State Department, is responsible for determining how we're going to make sure that all parties to a treaty are adhering to their obligations. So that's a functional bureau. Another functional bureau is Oceans, Environment, and Science. It's an office we work with very closely. I mentioned a few minutes ago that there's an office that deals with all of our science and technology bilateral agreements, and that's the OES Bureau, and they have 200 or 300 people working there. Many fellows from AAAS to IEEE to other professional societies, fellows choose to land in OES because they go very deep in areas relating to water. There are many oceanographers, there are geographers, biologists, microbiologists, any PhD level person. You will find a lot of fellows that choose to land in OES because it allows them to go deep and work in their area of expertise. So that's essentially the way the State Department is structured. If you're curious about specific offices, I would encourage you to go to the State Department website because they've got a fantastic organizational chart, and it's very big. And you go to state.gov, www.state.gov, and on the left-hand side there is a little link for an organizational chart. And when you click on that, you can actually bring up a version that has each chart box is an active link that will take you to the right part of the website, and you can learn about the assistant secretary that runs that particular office and their staff. So that's kind of a few things on state in general. Some examples of the kinds of things that I've been involved with. The advisor's office, as you might expect from the name, is an advisory office. And so we tend to go very broad, very long-term, long-range, strategic types of issues that would be of interest to the Secretary of State when she's thinking about the right kinds of policies that need to have some sort of science and technology engineering input. And so we go out and we find out what the trends are. Just this morning I was at a workshop that I helped the Arms Control Bureau organize on using open technologies, open challenges, information technologies, Twitter. How does that work in an arms control setting? And so we tend to get involved with things like that. I've been involved in a very wide range of very informal requests. These are coffee discussions. People will come by and ask me to have coffee with them, and they want to talk about cybersecurity. So they're leveraging the fact that I come from the science and software and semiconductor arenas, the technology sector. That gets leveraged almost every day in many, many different ways, and much of it's informal. Early on, I found out that we have an operations center in the State Department that is activated when the Secretary of State decides that some incident around the world, such as the Haitian earthquake, such as the tsunami, such as the Egyptian beginning of the Arab Spring in Egypt and then on into Libya, the Secretary will determine that an event is serious enough that she needs to activate the operations center. And what happens when she does that is there's a room that literally the lights go on, the computers go on, the links to the TV stations go on, and you walk into this room and there will be somebody from almost every agency in the government that shows up as a volunteer to do whatever needs to be done to deal with the emergency that's at hand. And so I volunteered for that duty on the Libyan task force, as it was called, and I was there in those days when we were trying to make sure that every American that was in Libya that wanted to get out, got out. And that was an amazing experience indeed, and those kinds of things you can't predict. Probably the coolest near-term thing that I've been involved with, because it involved bringing in more people from the private sector into the State Department's orbit, is a Clean Energy Speakers Bureau for the Western Hemisphere. And the cable on that just went out this week. And what it is 20-plus U.S. citizens who come from a mix of academia, NGOs, and the private sector who all know a thing or two about some aspect of clean energy, whether it's renewables, whether it's regulatory issues for the utilities, whether it's how to build more sustainable housing. These people have agreed to be available on a volunteer basis at the invitation of the embassies in the Western Hemisphere to come down and speak on their area of expertise. And so we're just getting started with that, and for the next 12 months it'll be interesting to see how many invitations are issued by the embassies. We expect a very enthusiastic response. In general, I've been spending a lot of time figuring out how to better connect startups into the thinking and doing of the State Department. There are a number of initiatives that we're just getting started and putting into place that involve the embassies that I can't really go into just yet because it's early days. But it's a very, very wide range of experiences, and it really, in the State Department, it really is up to you in terms of the office you choose to go into, and then how you choose to volunteer and put yourself in front of opportunities. It will determine the year that you have, which I like. I have very much liked that. A little bit more on the day in the life. I mentioned earlier that I'm working a lot with other agencies of the U.S. government. One example of that is a wonderful interaction between the State Department, USAID, NASA, and a couple of private sector companies that you probably heard of, Nike and Intel. And we are working on something called Launch. And Launch is a project to bring in innovators, maybe startups, maybe just individuals with great ideas, that relate to an area of interest to those partners commonly. And the last one we just did 2 weeks ago was on energy, and we brought 10 innovators into Kennedy Space Center, and we spent a 3-day weekend with them, actually over Veterans Day weekend, working with them with 40 people like me that come from the private sector, from the startup communities, and both here in the United States and elsewhere, to help them figure out what they need to do to grow their ideas or their businesses more rapidly. And an example of one of the 10 innovators was a wonderful company that has created a thermal battery along with a fast chiller capability that they're taking into India to dairies, so that dairies don't lose so much of their milk to spoilage when the power goes out, which it tends to go out rather often. 40% of the milk in India goes bad and has to be thrown away. And so this company has figured out a way to do a thermal battery that will help these dairies make it through the times when their power goes out. And we were working with this company to help them determine how best to grow their company. And they were able to close their first deal largely because they were spending that weekend with us in NASA, and the dairy wanted to be a part of it. So they agreed to buy the product during the time frame that we were at Kennedy Space Center. So that felt really good. Very effective program. I mentioned the arms control work in terms of helping them identify and source technologies to deal with some of their verification needs that they have. Open competitions is something that is of distinct interest throughout the U.S. government, and open competitions refers to putting a challenge out onto an open platform and then allowing U.S. citizens, no matter where they come from, to post their ideas on how they would solve that problem. And it's a very interesting and very, very effective, we're finding, way to bring in new capacities and allow citizens to have direct input and contribute directly to solving problems that normally would cost a lot of money and take a lot more time to solve. So if I were in the audience, I think I might spend a lot of time looking into that. And then one of the things I've done for years as a give back in the startup community is I've been involved in judging competitions, and so I'm continuing to do that. In fact, I was just in Sweden last week judging a competition at the Royal Institute of Technology, and the State Department Embassy Stockholm got involved by hosting a party for the judges. And so, that's one of the things that the State Department does very well. So that's a kind of a look at the different kinds of things that I've been involved with in the year that I've been here. I was very honored last summer when the science advisor came to me and asked me to consider staying. So I will be staying for an additional year. Unlike Sherry, I still own my house in Austin. So I haven't actually permanently moved to D.C., but I have found it to be a wonderful, delightful experience, and I am very, very excited to be staying here for an additional year. So I think with the wrap-up, there's a little information if you're interested to apply. You need to go to the website that's on this slide, and keep that deadline in mind that Sherry had mentioned to you in March, and look forward to maybe seeing you in the spring. And we're looking forward to any questions that you might have.
I believe someone has already asked a question.
Oh, so
yeah, there is a question on explaining more about the selection process. Let me just mention one thing that is at the bottom of the slide, which is still on your screen. In addition to the website where you can obtain the applications, as Becky pointed out, there will be an article coming out in this December's issue of IEEE-USA Today's Engineer. It's an online publication which all IEEE members get, and there'll be a complete article, more detail and more anecdotal information about the fellowships and examples of, again, both the Congressional and State Department fellowships. So please do look for it, and I think you'll enjoy it. The question that came in is to explain more about IEEE USA selection process for the fellowships. As I mentioned, the application, once you fill out the applications, and I'd like to mention that you can in fact apply for both fellowships. If any of you feel that your interests are sufficiently broad that you would be, strongly welcome the opportunity to be either a Congressional or a State Department Fellow, you're most welcome to submit 2 separate application packages. They will be evaluated separately. So that, don't use the same application and say you're interested in both. You really do need to apply fresh for each one, but you can certainly apply for both of them. But let me see if I can answer a little more specifically about the process, which is the question that came in. Once your application comes in, the committee will get together. All 6 members of the committee will get copies of your application, your complete application, which will include the resume, the application itself, your letters of recommendation. 3 letters of recommendation are recommended for each fellowship, and a statement as to what your goals are for the fellowship or why you're interested in the fellowship, and that's detailed on the website in terms of what materials you need to submit. So as soon as the deadline passes, all 6 members of the committee will receive copies of your complete package. We will then have a date set to get together, first by phone to discuss the applications and decide which of the applicants will be invited in to be finalists. Once you're selected as a finalist, you will be asked to come to Washington, of course paid for by IEEE-USA, and an interview. Typically, the interviews will take place over the course of 2 days, so we may spend 1 day interviewing applicants for the Congressional Fellowship and 1 day interviewing applicants for the State Department Fellowship. And when the State Department Fellowship interviews take place, a member of the State Department will be there as well as the committee. And of those finalists, then the selection of either 2 Congressional Fellows or 1 State Department Fellow or vice versa will take place pretty much at the end of those interviews. Sometimes there's a little more information that's requested, but we pretty much come to a decision certainly within a few days after the finalists are interviewed, and you will get your notification at that point. Does that answer the question?
I think one thing that Daryl had mentioned just now, Sherry, is that the actual sit down with the committee for each finalist is about 2 hours.
No, it's 1 hour. Each finalist will get a 1 hour interview.
Yeah.
And I guess I should mention that, since I mentioned that you can apply for both fellowships. If you do apply for both fellowships and become a finalist for both of them, which can happen, then that during that 1 hour we'll talk to you about both fellowships, so you don't have to go through that process twice.
And that was the case with me. I went in once, and they had somebody from the State Department in the room to take care of the State Department side of the equation. And I was perfectly happy with either one. In fact, I was offered either one, and then the committee, if I remember right, came back and said, you know, we think the State Department really, really would like to have you come to the State Department. So if you don't really have a preference, then why don't you go to State? And so literally that's how it happened. Very informally was how it happened with mine.
Yeah, actually, I also applied for both, but I did express a preference for the Congressional, so that was absolutely delighted.
So, you know, the other thing is, as we're waiting for maybe a question or two to roll in, you know, one thing that I should mention is the State Department really in the last 10 years has been undergoing a very focused, very intent effort to rebuild its science and engineering capacity. One of the side effects that I didn't realize until I got here, one of the side effects of the Soviet Union coming apart was that the State Department had to overnight create 17 new embassies from existing resources to cover all the new countries that were formed when the Soviet Union fell apart. And so they were having to take resources from existing embassies all around the world so that they could staff these new 17 because they weren't given additional money to deal with that. And so they were having to take science and technology officers out of some of their existing embassies and park them as an econ officer in, you know, Uzbekistan overnight. And so one of the things that happened was throughout the 90s, there was this decay and this decline of focused science and engineering expertise inside the State Department. And so Madeleine Albright in the late 90s asked the National Research Council to do a study to tell her what she needed to do to raise the capacity of the State Department after rebuilding all these new embassies. One of the top 3 recommendations that came back from that study was, they said, Madam Secretary, you need a science advisor again, and you need more science and engineering expertise inside the building. And so over the last 10 years, through these fellowship programs and through some very focused recruitment, the State Department now has a cadre of current and former fellows that numbers more than 300 people. Many of those 300 have chosen to become either full-time civil servants or have become foreign service officers. And so that's something that they've been very, very happy with in the State Department. And so I've found, a lot of people have a reaction of, why would the State Department be interested in an engineer? Well, it's because they are still wanting to further increase the proportion of their officers and their civil servants who have technical backgrounds. And so you will find lots of colleagues and a lot of interest and a lot of support if you choose that you want to apply for this particular fellowship. And that might not have been the case 10 or 15 years ago, but it certainly is now.
Yeah, good point. One question that I get asked quite a bit that I'll throw out to you is, when you're working in Congress and you're involved in, for instance, giving a recommendation on some bill from a technical point of view, you may not have that information at your fingertips, and because the pace is really quite rapid in votes coming up, and the senator or congressman needs a recommendation on which way to vote, and you need to get that information fairly quickly. You don't have the time to do the kind of in-depth research that you might normally do if you were working in academia or industry. You have a resource available to you which honestly I had no idea. It's called the Congressional Research Service, CRS, and they are actually an arm of the Library of Congress, and they have about 700 employees, approximately 300 or more of them are PhDs in very specific fields of areas where support might be needed for Congress, and they exist to serve as the research arm for members of Congress and their staff. And I can tell you that I personally consulted them on a number of questions where I needed very clear, very specific research very quickly, and all they ask is, what do you need and when do you need it? It's quite remarkable, and they're just absolutely delightful people to work with. It was something I had, oftentimes people ask, how do you know what to recommend or how to recommend? They don't make any recommendations, but they certainly provide the research and on your timetable for the information that you need. So that was really a fascinating thing to discover. I think I don't see any more questions coming in, but let me just say that both types of fellowships offer just profound experiences, and depending on your interests and what your future pursuits might be, please look seriously into applying for one or both. And I hope we've given you a taste of what it would be like. And do see the article coming up in today's Engineer.
Yeah, I want to say thank you to you, Sherry, and also Rebecca here for giving this great presentation. Again, the presentation will be online in a few days, and we will get out the PowerPoint presentation to all the attendees as well. Thank you all so much, and we are now ending the webinar. Bye-bye.